All
Okay,
right. Hope you can hear me and see me okay.
I'm fine. Yeah, I can. All right. I'm sorry I'm late. I had a interview offsite of the house. It was
No problem.
rush back. All right. Introduce yourself. Tell everyone what genre you write in and what you want us to know.
All right, that should be no problem. Hi folks, I'm Omari Richards, author of The Kimoni Legacy Initiation. This stickums right here. It is epic Afro fantasy, and it tells a story about the three Kimoni siblings, Kamau, Rizia, and Masalo, as they discover a major conspiracy against their clan, and they each branch out to figure out who's behind it. And along the way, they run into a lot of magic, monsters, demons, traitors, and worse.
Okay. Okay. So, what inspired you to become an author in the first place?
How much time we have? Basically, my father, he was a college professor, English teacher, and he was constantly reading to me and my brother, and he would always introduce us to all these different worlds, and that got me into reading. And then after a while, I was reading books like Treasure Island, Call of the Wild, those kinds of classics. And then I read Stuart Little, and it ended open ended with Stuart trying to go find Margot.
Mhm.
And I wanted to know what happens next. And then my teacher's like, "Well, there's not going to be another book, so why don't you write your own ending?" And that's basically what I did.
Oh
And
wow.
that's how I got into writing in a very abbreviated sense.
Oh wow. Okay. Can you walk us through the process of taking an idea from concept to a finished book for this particular book?
It is a very long marathon. The idea for this book came when I was 15 years old. That's when
Mhm.
the initial idea started, and the final book only got published in 2023. So that's about 15, 17 years between initial idea and final publication. I'm sure if I was writing any other genre, it would have been a lot shorter, but because it's epic fantasy, and not only epic fantasy, but Afro inspired fantasy, I really had to dive into just about every aspect I could find: religion, history, folklore, mythology, languages, because there just was not a lot to work with. So I really had to go out of my way to find research, materials, historical figures, all that kind of stuff. And along the way, I was just developing my own writing style. Like I wrote fan fictions from about the time I was 12 to 21, and compare my first fan fiction to my last entry, and it's a world of difference. And I was just constantly rewriting, writing, rewriting, deleting, rewriting. So it was a very long back and forth process. So I guess the long and short of it is, from idea to final publication, it takes a lot of patience and a lot of dedication, and you really need to zero in on the why of the project, the why of the story, the why of the characters, because after a while you're going to be sitting in the middle of the library surrounded by like 15 different reference books, just asking yourself, why am I doing all this work for free? Why?
Do you what is the difference between epic fantasy and high fantasy and urban
Um,
fantasy?
okay, so the split is easier with urban fantasy. So epic and high fantasy focus primarily on different worlds, and the authors have to basically create their own context within the world. For example, Game of Thrones is inspired by Western European history and Western European folklore, but it really creates its own context with it. The War of Five Kings is different from the War of the Roses in our world.
Mm-hmm.
There's a different context. There is a different mindset, and the job of the author is to guide the reader through this different world, guide them through this new context, and let them know just what these things are, what their significance is, and how it relates to the characters. And with urban fantasy, the major difference is you're taking fantastical elements like elves, dwarves, gods, demigods, and putting it in our context. So the trick there is to describe how these fantastical elements fit in our real world context.
Mm-hmm.
So would elves having pointing ears, would that change our modern day language? Would dwarves have to pay taxes for their mining efforts? Would gargoyles have to put out a flight plan to the FAA every time they fly somewhere? So urban fantasy is more so how the fantastical interacts with the mundane and vice versa. Um, and with high and epic fantasy, there's a lot of overlap, but the main difference is epic fantasy is your Lord of the Rings, your Wheel of Time, where it's very large scale, it's very stop the end of the world, very rags to riches story, and high fantasy is basically almost the same, but not always, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There are stories like the Iron Ring. There are, I guess, Dragon Riders of Pern is technically high fantasy. The video game Baldur's Gate 3, that is definitely more, well, as you can tell, there's a lot of overlap
Yeah.
because high fantasy can run into epic fantasy can run into high fantasy, but the main draw is you're in a different world, you're following these characters, and you are following these characters through accomplishing a major task, small or large.
Do you think that sci-fi will ever cross over with fantasy, or is elements of fantasy located in sci-fi?
They can definitely cross over because they are essentially doing the same thing but with different tools. You are bringing the audience into a new world, into a new context. It's
Mm-hmm.
just that with fantasy, it's usually swords, dragons, horses, kings, and queens. And
Mm-hmm.
with sci-fi, it's usually blaster rifles, ships, the Federation, the
Yeah.
Empire, mechs, spaceship battles, so on and so forth. And of course, there can be overlap. I don't know many stories that really do a lot of overlap, but one game that I know that did really well was Star Ocean Till the End of Time. It's like a old PlayStation 2 game
Mm-hmm.
where you start off in the future, very space opera, starship battles, space colonies, and then something happens, and then you end up on a planet with like that's basically medieval period with magic and everything, and they have to figure out, hey, what just happened? And there is room for crossover, and it's actually pretty interesting. I just don't know a lot of books that really do that.
What struggles did you endure during writing and publishing?
Um, how much time do we have again? Um, in terms of writing, the biggest struggle is just, like I mentioned before, just finding research material.
Mm-hmm.
Because I just going into Barnes and Noble or any American bookstore and look for any history about Africa, and the history they have usually falls in three categories. It's either um, the colonial period where European powers do something terrible, and then the
Yeah.
entire book is about that, or it's about a war crime or civil war or some kind of horrible internal war that happened, and
Yeah.
it's about the survivors and everything like that. Or three, it's about violence against women and all the stuff they had to endure to become refugees, etc. And you almost never see anything about kings or queens. I've yet to see a book in Barnes and Noble about Queen Nzinga of Angola, for example, or Queen Amandareus of Kush, or anything like that. In fact, I went to one Barnes and Noble when I was in South Carolina traveling, and then I went to the bookseller and asked them, "Hey, do you have any books about Mansa Musa?" And then the bookseller told me, Oh no, I've never heard of that rapper. To which I said, yeah, I was just looking for his new album, Timbuktu Timberlands.
Oh
So,
my God. No, I never
yeah,
heard of that rapper.
e-
Jesus.
exactly. That's the kind of stuff you have to go up against when you're trying to research anything about pre-colonial Africa.
Mhm.
Um, and also, if you go into any Barnes and Nobles or any major American bookstore, they have an entire section dedicated to European history. Anything about European history you can find. You can find like 20 different biographies about George Washington. You can find like 50 different biographies about King Henry V, or like 100 different biographies about Henry VIII, and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
I found one book about Cleopatra, and I got really lucky. And I found another book about the scholars of Timbuktu, but again, that was like in the corner and behind a book about the Rwanda genocide. So that kind of tells you where their priorities are.
So typically what they do to any black author or anything black.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. So fantasy has, since we talking about that, fantasy has been a white dominated genre. Do you think the success of black fantasy authors surprise people?
Um, well, yes, because anytime we do anything extraordinary or break barriers or just do something extraordinary, they're always like, how could they possibly do that? And it's like, we've been doing this for thousands of years. Like, when you really get down to it, Black fantasy isn't new. It's
Right.
stories about, it's the Anansi stories. It's the Epic of Sunjata.
Mhm.
There's this whole world of mythology and folklore within West African and East African mythology and folklore that is the basis of Black fantasy. So what
Mhm.
these stories are doing is really nothing new. They're just taking these stories and just repurposing them. Obviously, every author has their own spin on it, but there is precedent for Black fantasy. So acting like it's like this new extraordinary thing is kind of ridiculous. Like that's like saying, like when Lord of the Rings came out, that's basically Norse mythology mixed together with Celtic and Gaelic mythology. And Tolkien knew that, and he was very upfront about it. But he basically created the genre using those myths and legends, and that's basically what Afro fantasy is doing. It's taking these legends and putting a new spin on them and introducing it to new readers. Like, there's nothing new about that.
Before I ask you another question, this question is, what is Afro fantasy and why is it important to the culture?
Okay. Afro fantasy or Afro inspired fantasy is fantasy that is based off of the myths, legends, folklores, and histories that comes from the continent of Africa. Children of Blood and Bone is obviously the most well known example. There's also stories such as Red Leopard, Black Wolf by Marlon James. That is just A plus Afro fantasy.
Mm.
And there's also the Amaro series by Charles Saunders. It's more obscure, but it's basically Conan the Barbarian meets African mythology. So that's really cool. So it's basically anytime fantasy takes elements from African myth, history, and folklore and uses it as a basis to create their own stories. Not as different from when European authors or white authors take, Norse mythology, Gaelic mythology, Celtic mythology, and does their own thing with it.
Hmm. So, what makes a great fantasy book in your opinion?
Characters. Characters are the crux of just about every fantasy story that I really enjoy because the plots of fantasy stories more or less run the same, where it's like, a character of humble origin is a task to save the world or pull off this great heist or pull off this incredible feat, and they can't do it alone, so they gather up a ragtag bunch of misfits, and then they go off on adventures, explore the world, learn about each other, learn about themselves, until they're finally ready to face on this great evil or take on this incredible task. No matter what fantasy book you're reading, that is more or less the bones of it. But what makes each story unique are the characters and how they interact with the world, and how they apply the different lessons that they learn. Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, they're in the same genre, but they are vastly different. Frodo goes on an entirely different journey than Jon Snow, for
Right.
example. Baldur's Gate is very, very different from, say, Dragon Riders of Pern, but they all have that whole central core cast of characters that you just love, and those characters can really make or break any story. You could have a very well plot out story, but if the characters are bland and boring, it's going to fall apart.
Mhm.
But if you have a by the number story, but you have incredible and dynamic characters, people will love it. So for me, characters are everything in fantasy.
Okay. Does world building risk being overly saturated with complex language and foundational character development, or is that just what it is?
It can be. Especially in the beginning, that's something I struggled with this book, where you have to introduce so many different concepts and so many different ideas to the reader, and you have to convey it in a way that is not only believable but also not boring, and that can be pretty challenging.
Mhm.
But what I found is it's more important to convey what something means to a character as opposed to just explain it outright.
Mm.
So if there's a special day coming for a character, not necessarily their birthday, or like, something like, the reaping, and instead of like spending like 10 pages explaining what the reaping is, you convey the importance, the dread, through how the characters are interacting with it, the fear in the town, how everyone locks up certain the younger kids to make sure they don't get chosen,
Mhm.
just convey the overall sense of dread that tells the reader more than 20 pages of info dump could. So the
Mm.
key is highlighting what makes certain aspects of the world important to the characters. If it's important to the characters, it needs to be important to the readers, and that's how you overcome that hump, in my experience anyway.
Okay. So, why is it important to tap into Black folklore and mythology when writing fantasy or even paranormal, sci fi, urban fantasy, whatever? Why is it important, especially as a Black person?
Oh, because it emphasizes the importance of dreaming. It emphasizes the importance of imagining a world outside of your present circumstances, which is
Hmm.
something my parents really hammered into me and my siblings, is the world is only as big or as small as you allow it to be. And within American society, they want the world of Black people to be as small as possible. They want us to only know our neighborhoods. They want us to only know the roles that they've pre-assigned for us: rapper, sports star,
Yeah.
yeah, just those small roles. But
Mm.
when you read Afro fantasy, when you read just about any fantasy, it opens your mind to possibilities. It allows you to dream of something outside of what you see.
Mm.
And I think Tolkien said it best, where he said, escapism isn't so much, escapism is basically escaping the asylum, the same way a prisoner dreams of escaping the prison cell he's in. And
Mm.
that gives them the courage, the hope, and the daring to try and not only endure what's going on with them, but try to find a way out, and
Mm.
to just imagine something better for themselves, and that can give them motivation. When you watch this character of humble origins accomplish these great tasks, you think to yourself, "Hey, why can't I do something like this? Why can't I just, go beyond this street or talk to this person or push myself a bit more at the gym or at school or whatever?" And then all of a sudden, the world gets so much bigger. You see how much more out there is for you, and suddenly you're not limited to what society tells you can be.
Facts. So, what is Black history to you when it comes to Black fantasy and in literature?
Oh, they both are just everything because it highlights the creativity, the resilience, the
Mm-hmm.
flexibility of our people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading Henry Louis Gates's collection of African American folklore throughout the diaspora, and a lot of it emphasizes the different, the numerous tricks Africans and African Americans played on the powers that be in order to foster their escapes or to create prosperity for themselves. There's a reason like tricks of characters like Bear Rabbit and Anansi were really popular
Mm-hmm.
because they managed to scurry their way out of different situations, and those oppressing them were none the wiser until it was too late.
Mm-hmm.
So they provided examples on how to not only survive in this, environment, but to thrive and how to make sure you always get away, basically. So that is extremely important, especially nowadays.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I did a little research on you. So,
Mhm.
do you consider yourself Dominican or Afro Dominican?
Honestly, I have no idea. Because when you grow up Caribbean American, and this is something that I've encountered with other people in within this particular diaspora, when you grow up in a when you're always of like two minds where you grew up in a Caribbean household, and my wife can attest to this because her family is from the American South. My family's from the Caribbean, and
Mm-hmm.
we're both obviously black, but we have different like idiosyncrasies, different expectations, and basically slightly different cultures. So when you grow up in a Caribbean household, you basically get a Caribbean upbringing. So when you go out into America, they just see you as black. And then when you interact with Black Americans, there's going to be minor and subtle cultural differences, but just enough for you look at each other and you just say, "What are you saying?" Because there are certain turns of phrases, certain idioms, and just certain slang and different variations of AAVE that just don't that one side doesn't understand the other. For example, in most Caribbean households, there is almost no usage of African American vernacular English
Mm-hmm.
because in the Caribbean they were so the Queen's English was emphasized as a way to take everything the colonizers give you and use it against them. So that was that mindset. Whereas AAVE is more a counter language. It's more of a rebellious language.
Mm-hmm.
It's rejecting the Queen's English in favor of our own form of English.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get a Caribbean American and a Black American together in the same room, they're just gonna look at each other and it's like, why are you talking the way that you're talking? So it's both funny and very fascinating.
The reason why
So
I asked this question is leads me into you grew up in folklore and mythology told to you by your family, your parents and your family. So taking from that, how much of that had from the imagination of a child to adulthood has really garnered um this love for all of this fantasy and mythology and Western African culture and just Black culture in general.
it was just really fun just to have a different set of folk tales than everybody else because
Mhm.
when I was growing up, everybody knew Cinderella, everybody knew Frog the Frog Prince, everybody knew Snow White. Like, those were the only fairy tales people were talking about. And then, I had in my back pocket creatures like the Sukuya, which is basically a Caribbean witch, and she basically takes people into her home and she can like bewitch you, she can help you, she can she's it's a typical like witch archetype where it's like the outcasted elderly woman that everyone's like kind of wary of.
Mhm.
And then you defeat her by stepping on her shadow and suddenly she can't do her magic anymore. And there's also a creature, the moss, which is basically and this is actually one of my favorite stories. It is a creature that is hatched in a chicken coop, it a chicken lays an egg on Easter or something, and then when it hatches, it gives birth to like this monster that kind of looks like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, and then when it hatches, you have to say, I am your master, before it says, I am your master. Because if you say it to the creature, that means you control the creature. But if the creature says, I am your master to you, that means the creature controls you. So it was used as a way to explain like sudden misfortune or sudden fortunes. And and I've heard these stories going back and forth with my parents and my grandmother, and it was just always so cool to hear these stories, just because it's like, yeah, we don't talk about this in school. This is really awesome. So, of course, add in around the time I was watching Dragon Ball Z and on different animes, and so I would just, combine these two different ideas, and then it just created magic, and it was just so cool.
So you describe your work as sword and soul,
Yes.
epic fantasy. What does that mean?
Basically, Sword and Soul focuses on I guess the best way to put it is like it focuses on like a solitary warrior going through different worlds and encountering different creatures, different monsters. Almost like it's almost like Conan the Barbarian kind of fantasy, where it's like a solitary warrior surrounded by all kinds of different creatures. I think the best example is the Amaro series by Charles Saunders, where it's about the character Amaro, and he goes through different environments fighting different monsters.
Mm.
And I think the main key is like it's mostly episodic.
Hmm.
So there are different short stories that are chained together to create a larger narrative. But Sword and Soul mostly focuses on what it all means to the warrior, basically.
Your book, because look, I'm gonna tell you right now, I'm bad as fuck with names. I'm bad. You could tell me 20,000 times and I still fuck it up. But Kamoni,
Yes,
Kamoni Legacy, it really incorporates a lot of West African history and folklore, right? So
yes.
what statements were you trying to make in regards to your story? Because I always say that writing is a protest against the masses that wants
Right.
to hold us down. So what statement were you trying to make with that?
Um, how much time do we have again? I think the main one, I don't know. There's a lot. I think the main one is just the importance of knowing ourselves, knowing where we come from, and recapturing as much of our culture as we can, because it is basically all that we have to call our own. Um, One thing my dad always told me is that when you control how a man thinks, you never have to worry about what he does.
Mm.
So in the American education system and just in America in general, the basic idea is to pound us with this notion that we didn't do anything. There was nothing before we were slaves. There was
Mm,
nothing before we integrated.
mm,
And there is nothing after integration. Once the Civil Rights Act was passed, once Obama was in office, racism is over. You have nothing to complain about. You don't have culture. Your only culture is American culture. Blah 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 blah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, with my book, what I really wanted to accomplish was to highlight all the rituals, highlight all the cultures, and highlight the histories that the characters are comparing themselves to, that is helping shape their identities while they're also trying to find and maintain their own identities. And
mm.
that to me is like the back and forth within the African diaspora, where we're trying to maintain what we have, but also try to figure out, okay, who were we before? How did we get there? How did we get here? And what can we learn from those that came before us? So that's basically what I was hoping to accomplish with this, but who knows if I was successful.
Your book has a strong sibling dynamic, with each character experiencing unique, yeah, I say it's unique struggles because, uh, yeah, I get into those questions. Why was that important to show?
I think part of it was I think this one's more like personal as opposed to archetypal,
Mm,
where well, first of all, when you read epic fantasy, I can think of very few epic fantasies where the siblings have a good relationship. In a lot of fantasies, it's always like a struggle for the throne, a struggle for power, and
yeah,
so the siblings are always have like this Cain and Abel dynamic where one is scheming against the other one, or one fell to the dark side. Now the other one
yeah,
has to try to bring them back, yada, yada, yada. So I'm like, can we just start off with the siblings actually being siblings?
yeah.
So I really wanted to see how that would play out. And then once I started there, I was like, well, within royal dynamics, there's always going to be the favored son because you're the eldest son, you're the heir apparent, everything's going to fall to you.
Mm,
So how would that affect these particular relationships? And that came from me just kind of comparing myself to my older siblings because I'm the youngest.
mm,
My older siblings, they all went into very established careers. My brother's a lawyer. My sister is the head of her HR department. These are all things that have very clear career lines. And I took the more artistic route, which is very unconventional paths to success. So while they were following the set path, I was kind of meandering about, and that kind of created this whole sense of, well, what am I really doing here, kind of thing. But then when I spoke to them, they said, "Why were you envying us? We were kind of stuck. We were kind of stuck on our path, and you got to do what you wanted to do. We
mm.
wanted to be you." So that whole conversation has kind of created the different like point of views, because what one character believes to be true might not necessarily be true from the perspective of someone who's actually going through it. So that whole back and forth just really helped flesh out the different sibling dynamics and how they viewed each other and themselves.
So the youngest sibling, Kam, Kam, Kamayu?
Kamau.
Kamal. The
Yeah.
youngest sibling, Kamal, he was going through a whole coming of age type thing.
Hmm.
And then he wasn't because of the shit that went down at the I really don't want to say too much, but shit the stuff that went down. Why was it important to show that his coming of age was more than just, coming of age?
That came from again, this came from like my own experiences as a millennial, where we graduated, my generation in general, we did everything we were supposed to do. We graduated from college, and then as soon as we left college, the economy took a hit, and And suddenly all the jobs that people said that were supposed to be waiting for us after we graduated college, suddenly they weren't there. Suddenly we had no money. Suddenly we all had to move in with our parents. Suddenly we were all back into our teenage rooms, and suddenly we are like, am I even an adult? What's going on here? Like, I'm 21, 22, 23, 24. I'm still in my parents' house. I'm, my mom still does my laundry. I'm still in this extended adolescence, and I'm nowhere close to this adulthood that was promised. But if someone looks at me, they would say I am an adult, and but I don't have the trappings of adulthood. And then I was talking to my father about this, and then he said he was kind of envious of the initiation rituals in African clans where you kill the lion or you go on this quest, you go on this vision quest, and no matter what, as long as you're successful, you are seen as an adult. You have all the trappings of an adult. You have all the responsibilities and expectations of an adult. So I was like, that's very interesting. That's very clear. What happens when you fail and you're in this weird in between period where no one knows what to do with you? And then that thought led me to the creation of Kamau and his trials, because he's in that in between area where he's at the right age to be an adult, but because his initiation went left, he's suddenly in this space where no one really knows what to do with him. He's not sure what to do with himself, so he kind of has to figure it out from there.
So, Razia?
Yeah, Rizia.
Razia. Razia is about learning. She's about knowledge. She's about everything that can stimulate her mind. You put in this, and this, even in Africa shit, it's hell, it's in America too sometimes. But you put in that she faces like her bodily autonomy being taken away from her, mutilation ritual, being betrothed to someone, and that's not where she wants to be. That's not
Right.
what she wants to happen. And then it's also tradition versus going against tradition.
Yeah.
Why was that important, especially for her being a woman? I mean, a young girl. How is that important for you to put in the book?
Um, Mostly because as I was researching for her character, just about every African thing of research I could find was just a girl going through some horrible trial just to do something relatively simple.
Mm.
I read this one account of this girl. I think she was in Somalia, and she wanted to play basketball. She wanted to play basketball with her friends, and she wanted to take her basketball journey as far as she could take it. And then she gets accosted by highly conservative groups. Her basketball games get threatened. She almost gets kidnapped and all that kind of stuff. It was like, the girl just wants the ball. What the heck is going on? And then, it's always like this tremendous journey just to get somewhere just to get somewhere that should be very simple.
Yeah.
Another book I read was Girl in a Fig Tree, about a Maasai girl who faces general mutilation, and then she hides in a fig tree, and then she, basically escapes, gets her education, comes back to the village, and tries to educate the elders as to why this thing is bad, and there's a way to get to the spirit of this tradition without mutilating people. So it's that kind of wisdom and knowledge that I wanted to really lean into. And also it was important because in fantasy, female characters only seem to come in two forms, which is the damsel or, the hardened badass who can do anything. But in terms of a character, she's kind of like one note, or she says she's strong and then she's crying over her scraped knee 2 pages later. I'm like, yeah, what's going on here? So, so as I was researching, I learned about this woman named Nana Asma'u, who was the daughter of Usman Danfodio, who was the caliphate of the Sotoko Caliphate of northern Nigeria, and she was betrothed early, but she still managed to maintain her education. And then she grew up to become a very respected scholar, poet, and teacher of women about religion, the sciences, poetry, everything like that. And I was like, wow, yeah, that's very interesting. That's what I really want to explore with Rizia and other female characters within the book, which is alternate expressions of strength, alternate expressions of resilience, and the importance of, empathy, because Rizia is a very empathetic character. She feels for a lot of people, and I feel like with the hardened badass female characters that are being pushed out, a lot of their empathy is lost to the point where they're almost as callous as the people they're fighting against, which is interesting, but that's not the only way to go about it. So I just wanted to highlight alternate methods, if that makes sense.
That does. Now the oldest, Masalo.
Masalo.
I was close.
Very close.
He suffered a lot of loss. He
Yes.
suffered a lot of loss in this book. But he also had, even though it was a lot of vulnerability, it was a lot of strength and keeping the eye on the prize as far as, protecting his siblings and the tribe and all that. So why was it important to show vulnerability and loss? For because a lot of times in books, even fantasy books, they don't show, especially black characters, with having vulnerability. And family is either, is there or is not, or is broken, single parent home, this blah blah blah. So why was it important for you to show this?
Couple of reasons. One, because Maslow came about where I was reading a lot of fantasy books where the person who was held up as the best wasn't really the best. He was some kind of fraud, or it was some kind of accident, or he didn't really mean to become the best, but he just went with it.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to create a character who lived up to all the legends about him and was as good as everyone said that he was, with no asterisks or caveats. And
Mhm.
then as I was creating that layer, I was like, well, in order to get there, you have to start off pretty early, because a lot of warrior training starts when you're like 7 or 8,
Mhm.
and a lot of kids were thrown into war at that time because they were squires for knights, so they had to go along with them. So then I thought, so you basically have a whole bunch of child soldiers running around. And then that got me thinking, okay, I'm 10 years old. I've seen war. How would that affect me? And how would that affect my mindset? And then, it just kind of snowballed from there. But then I wanted to emphasize the family because I wanted to highlight how family is like a source of hope and inspiration for people, even in the most trying of times. Because no matter what Maslow is going through in the book, he's still holding on to the idea of seeing his son again. He's
Mhm.
holding on to this idea of keeping what's left of his family whole and protecting it, and that's what's keeping him going. And you see that a lot in Black American history, where people may be scared to escape the plantation, but if a family member escaped already, the desire, the hope, and the love of the thought of seeing them again overrides whatever fear is within the plantation, which allows them to take that major step and take on this, major feat of escaping and reuniting. And even when families are separated, they're still held together by this hope, however faint, of being reunited. So that's kind of what I wanted to explore with Maslow, to highlight that no matter what, that hope of reunion remains, and that can lead you into really great places, but also really dark places. And how do you make your way out of it?
Your book discusses a lot of African traditions, even rituals, um, some being upheld and others being challenged. How does that reflect real life?
Um, well, there in just about every culture, there's always that time where after exposure to outside societies, outside cultures, there's always that moment where it's like, wait, why are we doing this again? And of course there's always going to be pushback where it's like, well, this is the way it's always been. This is what we've always done. This is our culture. This is how we mark who we are.
Yeah,
But then the flip side is like, yeah, but this particular thing hurts people. So
yeah.
why are we still doing it? And I came across the idea when I was researching the whole loss of bodily autonomy with FGM
Hmm.
because when I was reading testimonies from the women who went through it and even the women who had it done to their daughters, the overarching theme was they didn't know or understand why they were doing it. They just knew this was something they had to do.
Mm.
And in terms of where it came from, it varies in terms of how certain cultures picked up on it, but the basic idea was once they picked up on it, they didn't want to let go of it because they just assumed this is what you're supposed to be doing.
Mm.
So it's I really want to like really highlight this idea that just because something has been done for so long, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to keep doing it. But at the same time, traditions are important because that's what marks your people. That's what marks your society. Because we've seen it where people come into our spaces, take our stuff, and then act like it was always theirs and not ours. So it's this whole push and pull dynamic where it's like, how much do you preserve? How much do you change? And where can we meet in the middle?
Okay. Do you think um YA and fantasy authors lose a sense? How can I explain it? All right. So, do you think white YA authors and fantasy authors uh lose a sense of wonder because of the cultures they try to pull from and can't really, say yay or nay about them? Whereas black authors who pull from cultures is based off of history that is passed down our lineage. And so even though it's hard to find said culture, do you think that uh playing into our culture is the reason why there are so small is a small amount of successful fantasy authors compared to white authors?
Oh, yeah. I think the biggest difference is that with white YA fantasy and European based fantasy in general, there's just so much information and there's so many different interpretations available
Mm-hmm.
that the initial intimacy, the initial meaning behind those myths are basically lost.
Mm-hmm.
There have been so many reinterpretations of Greek gods just
Yeah.
by themselves. Like it's very difficult, nearly impossible to understand or find the original meaning, the original purpose behind those stories. Like there is a reason why Zeus keeps cheating on Hera and why Hera keeps allowing it. There's this whole symbolic religious meaning behind that particular action that is very hard to come by and almost lost entirely because there's so many different interpretations to the point where all we know is that, oh yeah, Zeus cheated on Hera every other week. We don't know why, he just does it, so that's just in the story now.
Yeah.
But with African history and mythology and folklore, because we know how precious it is, how hard it is to find, and what it means for our people and culture, we are generally more we are more, and I don't want to say like we hold it in more reverence or anything, but we hold it with more esteem and respect, at least ideally,
Mhm.
where we know the power of these stories, we know the power of the griots, we know the power of storytelling in general. So in my experience, a lot of Black authors come towards these myths with that mindset where it's like I really want to get down to the essence of this thing. I want to get to the essence of this god, this ritual, so that I can convey its meaning to people who really need it. It's not just entertainment, it's something more. And I
Mhm.
think with white YA fantasy, it's mostly for entertainment.
Mhm.
And I mean, every now and then there is higher meaning behind it, like the God of War series. That's great. None of the gods in that game act like the way they do in the
Absolutely
folklore.
not. Absolutely.
Absolutely not. I mean, Zeus is still a jerk, so that's true, but everybody
Yeah.
else is kind of.
Yeah. No,
But
and that's one of my favorite games. So,
exactly.
so how what do you think about fantasy and comic books? How do they overlap, and what makes fantasy and comic book fiction or graphic novels resonate with the same audience?
Well, a lot of times I hear that comic books are the modern day mythology, and I think that's very true because, like mythology, the comic books characters are always changing and evolving in order to reflect the mores and context of their audiences. You know, Batman in the 1930s is completely different than modern day Batman because the concerns of people were very different. Superman in the 1930s is incredibly different from modern day Superman,
Mhm.
although more modern Superman stories are inching back towards his 30s interpretation because the mores and context of our society is starting to match the mores and context of the audience in the 1930s. And that's
Mhm.
basically what mythology is supposed to do. These mythological characters embody a certain archetype, a certain ideal within that culture. And then the whole point of the story is to showcase how that archetype, how that idea is applied.
Mhm.
Um, for example, just about every culture has the strong man, Hercules, Thor, Achilles, Sun Wukong, John Henry, Ogun. Like these are all like really powerful fighter, martial kind of guys, and their
Mhm.
stories always highlight how do they apply this strength, where do they go wrong with their strength, how does their anger affect their strength, and how does their anger create situations
Mhm.
and make things worse or make things better. And they're almost always like the ideal man. They get a lot of women, they have a lot of wives. But then it's all like, how do they treat people? How do they treat people around them? And, they are the ideal within that culture. So it's all about how is that applied
Yeah.
throughout the span of time, and then you reflect that you reflect that over to Superman, the guy who has all the powers in the world, all the abilities in the world, but he's still genuinely a good person. How do you remain a good person when the world around you is so corrupt? So that's kind of how, in my view, comics and myths just kind of align with each other.
You said the world is a dumpster fire so eloquently. I just said, uh, what would you like to see in the fantasy genre to change in regards to Black fantasy authors? And that goes for indie and traditional.
Just more variety, just give more people a chance to get their stories out there because I feel like every single time there is a successful Black story, whether it be Black Panther, Woman King, Children of Blood and Bone, it's always seen as a one off where it's like, oh yeah, we got this out there. We don't need any more Black stories. It's like, you had Lord of the Rings out there. Did that stop you from making more white stories? Because as soon as Lord of the Rings came out, the movie Aragon came out, and then we have The Witcher, and then we
Mm.
have, all these other white stories. But yes, Lord of the Rings is seen as the pinnacle, but that doesn't stop you from making more white European style stories. So why are we stopping with just Black Panther? Why are we just stopping with Children of Blood and Bone? Why are we just stopping with Woman King? There should be thousands upon thousands of other stories like them out there, because
Mm.
those three works, they're great, but they don't cover everything. They each have their own flaws.
Mm.
And if more black oriented stories were sent out into the public, those flaws could be covered. Like, if you wanted a more accurate rendition of Black Panther with better accents, there's, this book, this movie, this story. If you want a more historically accurate Woman King, there's this movie, this book, this comic book.
Mhm.
Um, Even with my story, if you want a more focused story that is about one particular ethnic group, as opposed to the hodgepodge that I have, there's this story, there's that story, there's this book, there's this movie. So what I want to see is just more variety. Like, we should not be able to just fit every major black story in 1 month. There should be so many stories we can't even cover them all.
Yeah, because right now Game of Thrones is like the Fast and Furious of fucking books. It's never ending. It's never ending.
Yeah.
What does success look like for you in the fantasy genre?
Um, my wife asked me this question, and I made her laugh with my answer. Success to me is when I am a clue on Jeopardy.
I did not expect that. Okay. Do you think black fantasy authors who showcase their culture lose white readers because they see so much blackness and culture that they'll say, "Oh, it's too much blackness," and I can't relate to the stories on these pages and struggle to view it as fiction when that's what they tell us when we complain about this shit.
Um, honestly, if honestly, if they say that, they are never going to read your work anyway. So
Mm.
I don't really sweat it. Because I grew up within the mindset that I grew up with was, if don't wait for white people for the party to start. Just do your party, do your thing, and then if they show up, they show up. You welcome them, give them a beer, and then tell them to go in the back or whatever and just enjoy themselves. And if they don't show up, then keep doing your thing. Like, you shouldn't let white acceptance or white expectations or white comfort dictate how you do your thing.
Mm.
So if I lose white readers because it's a predominantly black cast, then honestly, no skin off my nose. Probably weren't going to enjoy it anyway. I'm not going to break my back trying to change my stuff just because you are so self-centered that you can't put yourself in the shoes of somebody else. So, no skin off my nose.
If you could collaborate with one fantasy author, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Yeah, just one.
Just one.
Eh. Um, right now, I think I want to collaborate with Evan Winters, who wrote Rage of Dragons. Um, because reading his book really helped me fine tune my book.
Mm.
Because he has a very intricate caste system within his book. And then when I read that, I was like, oh shoot, I don't have a single caste system in mind. I gotta fix that. Or, his world was like really intricate. Like, it was very focused, where mine initially was meandering. So I was like, oh man, I gotta tighten up this, I gotta tighten up that. So yeah, I would love to work with him, or I know he said one, but him or Marlon James, because his whirlwind was just like. it blew mine out of the water. I was like, oh man, mine is just so shallow. I gotta fix that too.
So why YA?
Um,
YA,
why
young
A?
adult, whatever you want to call it.
Um, I think it's because, well, the characters are within the YA new adults
Yeah.
section, and I just wanted to emphasize that all three of the characters are in this point of transition in their lives where they are trying to figure out they have their upbringing, and now this is where they're in the stage of life where they have to decide how they're going to apply that upbringing.
Mhm.
So that to me coincides more with the YA new adult from like 16 to probably like 20 and 21,
Mhm.
where you're on the tail end of high school, you're about to enter college, or you just graduated from college, and suddenly all the guardrails, all the rules, and all the guardrails within your upbringing are removed, and you're left to your own devices, and you're like, oh shoot, I'm on my own. What am I supposed to do now? And then so that to me just kind of coincide more with YA new adult as opposed to full on adult. And also, I like writing fight scenes and gory scenes, but I don't want to do the more adult oriented
Yeah.
gore fests that are in the more darker fantasies. Like, as much as I love A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, I don't think I'm going to reach that level of graphic
Yeah.
violence.
Especially since there's so much people or families sleeping with each other throughout the whole goddamn fucking book. That should be a little too much for my ass. Um, Now, I want you because this is going to go up on YouTube. This is going to go on Spotify. This is going to go on my website. What? Give me a summary, a short summary of your book and why people should, who are interested in fantasy, should get your book.
Okay, so the Kimoni Legacy is an Afro-inspired fantasy that takes the generational storytelling of Alex Haley's roots and combines it with the political intrigue, feuding families, and low magic system of A Song of Ice and Fire slash Game of Thrones. So if you enjoy reading about the different schemes and plots within a clan, if you enjoy reading about young characters trying to figure themselves out while they're also trying to take on this enormous task, and if you like reading about characters who really try to take their fates and destiny in their own hands, then this book is definitely for you.
Okay. Where can readers find your books?
You can find it on Amazon. You can also find it on my author website, omari-richards.com. You can find it in bookstores such as Mahogany Books, the Melanin Library, and Busboys and Poets.
Hmm. What are all your social media handles?
So I'm on TikTok, O Richards underscore author. I'm on Instagram and Threads, which is Omari underscore A underscore Richards. I'm also, what else am I on? I'm also on Blue Sky, which is O Richards again. And I think that's it. Yeah.
Are you attending any book events?
Um, yes, I'm going to be in LA at the Annuals Writers Conference in March, on March 26th through the 29th.